Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to give a talk on behalf of the Ben Urey Gallery as part of the exhibition programme for A Brush with Evil. Thank you to Sarah for kindly inviting me to speak and to Rekha for the tech. I'm really excited to be able to give a talk to set the works that are on show in context. Two of Laura Knight's large preparatory drawings created in 1946 in Nuremberg at the trial of Nazi war criminals. These are working studies for her commissioned painting, now in the permanent collection of the Imperial War Museum, the Nuremberg Trial of 1946. Sarah's fantastic exhibition, which I had the privilege of looking at, explores the background to Knight's commission, her arrival in Nuremberg, and her experiences inside and outside the courtroom as both witness and spectator, aspects of which I'd like to discuss this evening, alongside setting her work at Nuremberg within the context of her career and especially her commissions during the First and Second World Wars. Dame Laura Knight was one of the leading British painters of the 20th century. She was the first woman in a century to be accepted as a full member of the Royal Academy of Arts and was made a dame in 1929, having risen to the top of her profession. During the course of an extraordinarily productive career that spanned over 70 years, Knight's work reflected her commitment to depicting modern life. Due to her exceptional talent and unstinting hard work, Knight was able to establish herself as a professional artist, earning a living through her art in the 20th century. Knight's contemporary relevance, over 50 years since her day, continues today through the increasing interest in her work and life. And the image that I'm showing you here actually shows Knight at an exhibition towards the end of her life in 1963, in which we can see the Nuremberg trial. Well, it's actually a second painting that she did of that work, and the two preparatory drawings that are on permanent loan to the Ben Urey Gallery. And this is just one of many exhibitions that have been held recently for Dame Laura Knight, which include Laura Knight, a celebration at Penley House Gallery and Museum in Penzance in 2021, and Laura Knight, a panoramic view at Milton Keynes Gallery last year, and also in the setting of auction records for her work. As I will explore this evening, Laura Knight successfully negotiated the professional art world at a time when other women artists struggled for recognition and sought to control her public image with 2 volumes of her autobiography. Laura Knight's first autobiography, Oil Paint and Grease Paint, was published in February 1936, within days of her historic election as a Royal Academician on the 11th of the month. In July 1965, aged 87, Laura Knight published her second autobiography, The Magic of a Line, written with the same perception, zest and subtlety of observation as her first book, Oil Paint and Grease Paint, but more reflective in tone. In it she accords particular significance to her work as a war artist, especially for the Nuremberg trials. In A Look at My Life, fellow artist and later Royal Academician Eileen Agar recalls that not many women were inspired to produce war paintings, but Dame Laura Knight was a notable exception. Both autobiographies record how over the course of 80 years, from studying at the Nottingham School of Art in the 1890s until her death in 1970, 3 days before a large retrospective exhibition at Nottingham Castle Museum and Art Gallery, Laura Knight forged a highly successful artistic career. Both autobiographies are her insightful and personal version of events. While some dates and memories may be less than accurate, there are certainly some discrepancies between this and her second autobiography, The Magic of a Line, published almost 30 years later. It is very much her record of events, her way of securing her legacy in print in her own words. In it, she speaks of herself as being a student for the first 25 years or so of her life, from the precociously talented drawings she made at school in her early teens to the tender depictions of hard-working lives and staiths in Holland. and she certainly felt when she woke to the Cornish sunlight and the company of artists that enabled her work to blossom. Reviews of her first autobiography were enthusiastic, finding that, and I quote, she had created a portrait of herself in words that is almost as solidly three-dimensional as her own portraits of circus folk. Another found, as vivid as her personality, as vigorous and vital as are her pictures, the book is the woman. Laura Knight was herself a performer, in her own time what we would call a celebrity, well able to generate publicity for her work and her accounts of her life. She wrote, I am thankful to have known the tasks and struggles of common life, joy and despair like any other mortal. I am just a hard working woman who longs to pierce the mystery of form and colour. In her second autobiography, The Magic of a Line, she wrote, painting, music, ballet, theatre, circus, art and physical skill. What joy to project oneself in each, to feel the daring of the acrobat, the control of the artist in understanding and sympathy of many lives in one. Through all of these, she sought to project an image of herself, the professional artist who overcame early adversity to gain a place at the heart of the art establishment. At the same time, she challenged contemporary conventions. A trailblazing professional woman artist, she insisted on fair remuneration. She often depicted people at the peripheries of society and championed fellow women artists, heralding a way for others to pursue their own careers. By shaping her own legacy, she presented her contemporaries with a particular view of herself that she wished to present. It is this character, her works and the world around her, which has coloured the way we view her and her works today. The work that I'm now showing, the model self-portrait of 1913, is currently taking centre stage in the newly reopened National Portrait Gallery. And if you haven't been to see the newly reopened NPG, I really urge you to do so and to make a beeline for the 20th century galleries, in which this work really does sing on its own special wall. It's slightly proud of the other exhibits. It's life-size, and you really do get a sense, I hope in this image, of the colours, the dynamism that's in this work, the boldness, the audacity that Laura Knight has in depicting her fellow artist, Ella Napper, in this work. Painted in Cornwall in the year preceding the outbreak of the First World War. It was in Cornwall where she had settled with her husband, or her artist husband rather, Harold Knight. It was there that Laura found a newfound confidence and freedom among a group of fellow artists. For Knight, this period in Cornwall also coincided with one of financial success. She writes, now there was no shortage of cash. Both of us were doing well, and I could sell nearly everything I touched, an exhilarating experience. Perhaps this allowed or even encouraged Laura to undertake this work, perhaps her most artistically successful work, a bold study in composition and colour. In a palette of reds and pinks, contrasting between flesh-coloured tones of the nude and the deep crimson red of Laura's knitted cardigan depicted in heavy impasto. The work's life-size dimensions make it a physically imposing work, the viewer captivated by what Laura's gaze is capturing from beneath her black hat. Laura both declares her artistic credentials, her mastering of the nude figure, and depicts her friendship with fellow artist Ella Napper, who poses as the model. Both women had recently moved to Lamorna, around the coast from the artist colony of Newlyn, living within a few hundred yards of each other. In Laura's new studio at Trethinnick, at the inland end of the Lamorna Valley, Ella came to pose. Consisting of three planes, the artist, the model, and the canvas on which a further image of Ella appears to Laura's left, she creates a painting within a painting. The reviewer Herbert Thomas wrote of the rapturous reception given to Mrs. Knight's Triumph on the work's first public showing at the Passmore Edwards Art Gallery, Newlyn Art Club. It's interesting that Laura continued to exhibit and hold on to this work for the remainder of her life. Following Laura's death, the painting, now known as Self-Portrait, was purchased from her estate by the National Portrait Gallery, where it now sits and which can be enjoyed by many.
During the First World War, Knight remained predominantly in Cornwall, painting figures set against the Cornish coastline. Government regulations prevented painting near the coast, but this was circumvented by permits to sketch. And this work depicts two of her regular Cornish models, Phyllis Vipon Crocker and Marjorie Taylor. And resting close by is Laura's Scottish terrier dog, Tip. You can just see his little collar as well, who appears in a number of works from the period. Spring was created actually during the First World War, and it's in Tate's collection. And for those of you who went to Milton Keynes, this work was hung very low, and it was almost as though you could step into that incredible Cornish landscape. So the couple that you're seeing are Charles and Ella Napper, who were great friends of the Knights, and they'd arrived in Cornwall during 1912. In oil paint and grease paint, Laura discusses the difficulty of working in the open air due to wartime restrictions. She writes, "This picture was painted during the World War I. At that time, it was against the law to paint out of doors, anywhere near the Cornish coast. And to get the material I needed here and there, I had to lie on my stomach under a gauze or any other convenient bush in dread of being taken off to prison. To make a line or two in a sketchbook, memorize, rush back into my studio in paint. In spite of working conditions, the finished painting, as I'm sure you will all agree, is a beautifully evocative depiction of the Cornish countryside. Spring abounds, the tops of the trees coming into blossom, the lambs are grazing, there are swifts or swallows flying high in the sky. And yet, there is that rainbow cutting in, possibly a symbol of hope, but also that very dark, brooding sky behind it. And for me, that rainbow also calls to mind one of the first two women Royal Academicians, Angelica Kaufmann, worked entitled Colour, which if you go into Burlington House at the Royal Academy and look up, there are her wonderful 4 roundels in the ceiling. And one of those is Colour, in which she is taking literally the palette, the colour on her palette, out of the rainbow. During both World Wars, Laura undertook a variety of government commissioned works. In 1916, she received a £300 commission, which is a huge sum of money, to paint a canvas for the Canadian War Records Office, the brainchild of the Canadian-born newspaper magnate Sir Max Aitken, later Lord Beaverbrook, on the theme of physical training in a camp. She produced a series of studies, watercolour drawings and paintings on canvas of boxing matches at Whitley in Surrey. And Whitley Common is actually owned by the National Trust, so a property that I've actually, well, it's not a property, it's a landscape that I've actually been to, and it is really incredibly beautiful. In this work, Knight depicts Joe Shears of the 156th Canadian Infantry Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force and his opponent, Corporal W. Aitken, set against a brooding sky. At the time, Shears was the Imperial Forces bantamweight champion. In 1918, works from this period and Cornish subjects were included in Camp Life, a solo exhibition at the Leicester Galleries, London. And what I particularly love about this work is not only the incredible physical skill of the boxers, but also the audience that you're seeing, all those men watching the two. And I think that's what Knight is really fantastic at doing, is capturing an audience, whether that's at the ballet, at the theatre. And I think that obviously foretells what she does at Nuremberg. She is literally watching that performance, the trial. And it's something that she depicts in so many works, but in such a clever way here, where they're very low at the feet of the men fighting. At the 1928 Summer Olympics in Amsterdam, Laura won the silver medal in painting with this work, which is boxing in camp. And interestingly, I was saying about works coming up at auction. This work came up at Sotheby's a few years ago. I think it was unsold, possibly it's sold after that. But I think it's quite interesting that opportunity is given when works come up at auction for us to see works that possibly haven't been shown. I mean, the two drawings that you've got here, I think, were sold in, was it 1963, Sarah? And then obviously didn't come up again until they came up at William Wallace, did they? So I think, you know, often things go into private collections and aren't seen for a long time. And I know that John Croft, one of Knight's relatives, is doing a lot with his catalogue resume to chart, and it's all online. So you can have a look online, and that actually shows you all the works that he's found that are in collections, and they're actually all by group, so that you can actually look at what's out there. I think when someone did it the other day, I think there are 2,000 works on that website at the moment, which is really interesting. So following the First World War, in January 1919, Laura and Harold Knight, who was himself a conscientious objector, left Cornwall for London, but she kept her Lamorna studio, continuing to return to Cornwall most summers. On moving to London, Laura's wide circle of sitters was drawn from the world of the ballet, circus, music, and theatre. And I'm just showing you a publication, sketch publication, that was done in honour of her becoming an associate of the Royal Academy in 1927. And in this work of the artist Eileen Mayo, who actually had a very large exhibition down at Towner, Eastbourne, I think it was last year now, and also there's a book on her, part of the Eiderdown series. So she was an amazing artist in her own right. But Knight is really showing her own artistic skills, that she's a professional artist. Here she is in a studio with her palette and her paintbrushes in her hands, with an easel, with this incredibly large work depicting Eileen Mayo in the background. For Knight, the Royal Academy was an institution that played a critical role in her career and legacy, in how she has been viewed, the work she exhibited, commissions she gained, her remuneration, and ultimately the depository for a large holding of works from her studio. So the Royal Academy did a number of years ago, I think it was it Drawing from Life or Working from Life, which was a really beautiful one-room exhibition of hers. And there was a lovely publication that went with that. But they actually showed a lot of those drawings, which are in their archive, which everyone is free to go and see. And they are really wonderful. There's hundreds, literally hundreds of them that came from her studio. But they're really beautiful because some of them are literally just line drawings of ballerinas on the stage as part of the Ballet Russe. So it's fantastic that they're at the Royal Academy. So Knight was elected as an associate of the Royal Academy in 1927. But in 1922, some 5 years previously to Laura Knight's election, Annie Swinnerton, an artist that I'm sure not many people know, a friend of mine, Katie Harrington, is doing lots of work. There's going to be a book on her and an exhibition. And she was a Mancunian artist, but she was the first woman to become an associate of the Royal Academy before Laura Knight. And in the year that Annie Swinnerton was elected an ARA of 1922, Knight wrote an article in the Studio called "Can Women Succeed as Artists?" And Knight wrote that women require equality of opportunity before they can succeed on the same terms as men. And in her 1936 autobiography, Knight acknowledged her debt to Annie Swinnerton. She wrote, "Any woman reaching the heights in the fine arts has been almost unknown until Mrs. Swinnerton came and broke down the barriers of prejudice. A prejudice natural enough, for woman's life is set in another direction." And the image that I showed at the beginning was that really wonderful image on the left, and then on the right, an outfit. To me, both these outfits, I think, are very evocative of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, especially the incredible jacket on the right-hand side that I was saying to Sarah earlier. There are photographs of her, gosh, really, I mean, it must be in the late 60s, just before she dies, where she's wearing the jacket on the right-hand side as well. What I love about Laura Knight is she keeps her hairstyle the same, I think, pretty much throughout her whole life. And it really suits her. She looks wonderful in these photographs. So she was photographed by this amazing society photographer, Bassano, and this was really to celebrate her becoming a full Royal Academician, the first woman to become a full RA since its foundation with Mary Moser and Angelica Kaufman. And so following her election, Knight writes about an army of pressmen and photographers camped outside her studios. The papers emphasised her rag to riches story, which she'd written about herself in her books, and she was also featured in a British Pathé newsreel. And the Pathé newsreels are definitely worth watching. They're on YouTube, so they're freely available to watch. But I think it's quite interesting how she kind of portrays herself in those at this time. She was also bound to give the Royal Academy something called a diploma work, which is a work that all Royal Academicians, when they're elected, gift to the Royal Academy. So it's something that still goes on today. And the work that she gifted to the Royal Academy is this, which is Dawn. And Annette Wickham, who is the curator at the Royal Academy, has written about this idea of giving a work, which work that you choose. And the choice, she writes, was up to the individual artist and was inevitably influenced by many competing considerations, ranging from an artist's interest in posterity to the more prosaic factors, such as the number of unsold works in the studio. But I think what this work does is show Knight's mastery of the nude as well, which she was very keen to emphasize. For Knight, this work also embodies both her cementing her place at the Royal Academy and in the British art world of the period, heralding a new chapter of her career post-election. And as a full Royal Academician, Knight also participated in the selection and the hanging of the annual exhibition. And there are wonderful photographs of her actually in the exhibition rooms for the press days as well. However, she was not allowed to attend the Royal Academy's all-male dinner, which was held every year at the summer exhibition. But following her election, the Society of Women Artists did hold a dinner in her honour to celebrate her achievements. It wasn't until 1967, so 3 years before she died, when women ARAs and RAs were permitted to attend the annual banquet. And only after campaigning by Gertrude Hermes, elected herself an ARA in 1936, were women finally allowed to go to that dinner. And Maxwell Fry recalled how the spirit of truth and justice overwhelmed him as he watched Laura Knight slowly descending the Royal Academy stairs. She has been a member a lot longer than me, Hermes told him, but never a dinner has she eaten in this place. How times have changed. But what I'm showing you is something that I was really excited about, because I'd read about this silver salver that I'm showing you an image of, but I didn't know where it was until I spoke to Annette Wickham, who's the curator of works of paper at the Royal Academy. And not only did people give diploma works, but they gave silver a lot of the time to the Royal Academy. And this salver was actually left to the Royal Academy on Knight's death. Now, I know that Sarah is doing an exhibition with Una Richmond, who's here tonight, on sheer verve, the Women's International Art Club, which opens in a few weeks, which I'm really looking forward to coming back, because there are going to be so many amazing women artists that Eileen Aker, who I've mentioned, but Ethel Cahoon and Marlo Moss. But I think what's really interesting is that Laura Knight was a member of both. There's going to be, I think, a clown work here by Laura Knight. So she was a member of both of these societies. And I think what this salver says is that women were forming their own societies. If they couldn't be admitted to the Royal Academy, they could be a member of the Society of Women Artists and the Women's International Art Club. They could challenge the discrimination and exclusivity of established institutions, creating their own platform for exhibiting and garnering patronage. And Knight was the president of the Society of Women Artists from 1932 until 1968. And she was presented with this inscribed salver in recognition of her service to women artists. And you can see that it was wrought as a token of affection for their president. And yes, and so Annette really kindly photographed that for me. So I think it's interesting that Knight is a member of both, and that the Society of Women Artists plays such an important role in her life. She not only promoted her own work by displaying it there, but also the careers of contemporary artists. And there are amazing publications as well that go along there. And their archive, which I've been to, is actually held by goldsmiths. And that's an incredible archive. I think some of the earlier archive was lost in bomb damage during the Second World War. But certainly from the 1940s onwards, there's an incredible archive of all the women that were exhibiting. And they were often exhibiting at the Royal Academy, and then at the Society of Women Artists. So as I said, Knight graced the office until she retired in 1968, and then she was patron, continuing to exhibit up until her death in 1970. And she really did continue right up into her death exhibiting. During the early years, however, of her time as president of the Society of Women Artists, and shortly after her election as a full Royal Academician, Laura Knight undertook commissions during the Second World War. For most of the 20th century, women artists had limited opportunities to encounter the realities of the front line or to even enter the war zone. No women were commissioned to go to the front line in the First World War, although the Imperial War Museum acquired a small number of works after 1918. The Second World War led to a sustained period of patronage for Laura Knight. In Britain, during the Second World War, the role of providing a pictorial war record led to the formation of the War Artists Advisory Committee, the WAAC, in November 1939 within the Ministry of Information. And it was instigated and chaired by Sir Kenneth Clarke, who was at that time the director of the National Gallery. And what he and the committee wanted to do was to assemble a collection of works that recorded life at the front and in wartime Britain. More than 400 artists were involved, of whom 52 were women, just under 13%. And Evelyn Dunbar was the only woman employed on a full-time salaried basis. The committee was responsible for the commission or purchase of just over 5,000 works of art, and some were distributed to museums and galleries around Britain, but the majority, over 3,000, are held at the Imperial War Museum. Only two women, Laura Knight and Mary Kessel, were commissioned to go abroad to record the Second World War, but both travelled after the fighting had ended. Knight's Second World War commissions, whilst artistically an incredibly significant body of work, are also important for how she championed fair remuneration for her work as a professional artist, a legacy for women artists, both contemporary and succeeding her. Knight certainly had faith in the worth of her work, both artistically and financially, illustrated throughout the letters between Laura Knight and the committee, now held by the Imperial War Museum. The letters offer an interesting insight into her working methods and the importance that she placed on making sure that she was fairly paid. In 1939, Knight was approached by the government regarding a poster commission for the series on Britain's war effort depicting food production. The poster design was commissioned to highlight the work of the Women's Land Army. She was offered a sum of 10 guineas for a preparatory sketch and 70 guineas for the finished work. Knight accepted the commission, but objected to the stipulation requiring her to submit a sketch. The secretary of the committee, a wonderfully named E.M. O'Rourke Dickey, replied that this was necessary, even in the case of a distinguished artist like herself. Knight reluctantly accepted the conditions, and after many delays due to the terrible British weather, took upon studying members of the Women's Land Army at work in the fields of Malvern, close to where she lived during the course of the war. So the letters are really wonderful. I don't know, Sarah, if you've got any facsimiles of those letters between her and the committee here. Oh, fantastic. Okay. Oh, great. Yes. So they're really, really wonderful. Obviously, it's handwritten, kind of battle of will, shall we call it, between her and the secretary. Her first sketch was rejected on the basis, and I quote that, "The emphasis in your design is so very strongly on the horses and so little on the girl that the message which we wish to convey would not really get to the public." Knight then changed the design from 3 girls working on a plough to the 1 girl in the final design, which you see here. Knight's handling of the committee and its requirements reveal a tough, undaunted approach to business, befitting her status as one of Britain's leading artists. In August 1940, Laura agreed to paint a head and shoulders portrait of a WAAF, Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer, for a fee of 35 guineas, if the officer would come to Malvern. The subject of her portrait is Corporal Daphne Pearson, and the GC is George Cross of the WAAF. On the 31st of May 1940, during an air raid, Daphne Pearson was out of doors near the WAAF buildings at Detling in Kent. A friendly bomber crashed close by her on takeoff, and despite knowing that there were unexploded bombs on the aircraft, Corporal Pearson rushed to the wreckage, rescuing the pilot and protecting him from the bomb blast. She was awarded an Empire Gallantry Medal, later transmuted to a George Cross. And this painting is really wonderful when you see it in real life, and you see that wonderful landscape of Malvern that she becomes so famous for depicting. But you can see the sitter looking up at that brooding sky and carrying a respirator. Now, originally, and this is where the letters between her and the committee are quite interesting, Knight portrayed Corporal Pearson holding a rifle, but falling foul of the censors, women at this time were not permitted to bear arms. The rifle had to be painted out in favour of a gas mask. The portrait of Corporal Pearson was considered a great success by the WAC, and Laura was then asked to paint this work, which is Laura Knight, Assistant Section Leader, Henderson and Turner. And actually that's the image that Ida Down Press used for the book that I wrote on Laura Knight. And that's actually one of a series of books, which, if you haven't heard of them, really wonderful. Harriet, who's the editor for those. I think she started, I think I was number 4, but a few of them were published at one go. And I think the latest one is on Tizar Garwood, who was Eric Revilius's wife. But there have been ones on Eileen Mayo and Nina Hamnet. So they're definitely worth seeking out. I think she's up to about 10 now, and that carries on. But they're really beautiful, beautifully presented books. So Corporal Elspeth Henderson and Sergeant Helen Turner were both awarded the Military Medal for Bravery in 1940, whilst based at RAF Station Biggin Hill in Kent. And again, this was painted actually at Knight's studio in Malvern. So the sitters came to her. And I think she really captures, even though that was painted in her studio, a sense of these women on duty. Knight had originally been commissioned to paint a triple portrait, but again, she was fighting with the committee about her enumeration. So it ended up with her painting this wonderful double portrait and then a separate portrait of Corporal Robbins. I think she called it a paltry sum of money, which was offered to her for the triple portrait. Knight's continued objection to the fees offered for these commissions ultimately led to better remuneration for all portraits made as part of the war artist's scheme. So not just for herself. After the success of her portraits, the committee commissioned Knight to portray the vital work of women working with barrage balloons. Relishing the task of painting what she described as, I think it's such a great description, colossal silver toads, which I think they just look exactly like that. This commission of a balloon site in Coventry was intended in part to bolster recruitment for the RAF balloon commands. Barrage balloons were an integral part of Britain's defences during the Second World War by forcing German planes to fly above 5,000 feet, reducing their accuracy. And it also made them more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Knight's painting, like many of her ballet and circus work, emphasised the coordinated skill of the team. And Knight wrote about the people working on the barrage balloon, and they're not all women in this work. In snow and gale, these girls do their duty. No praise is too high for their staunchness. And why I'm showing this work is because with the Nuremberg work that's shown here in the gallery and that we're going to be looking at in detail in a little while, you can actually see the landscape of industrial Coventry behind. That idea that she's merging those two together in a very evocative way. Throughout the war, Knight showed her adaptability and fortitude by creating temporary studios in order to depict her subjects in their working environment. And we're going to see that at Nuremberg, where she creates now wonderful photographs here, that temporary studio. And I'm just showing you, which I think is a fantastic image, and there are more in this series, but a famous artist studio in a bomber factory, which is a series of photographs which is held by the Imperial War Museum. And this was commissioned by the Ministry of Information. And it was showing Knight within this factory talking to women who were working in a bomber factory. And Knight talks about her experience of working within these different environments. I mean, she talks at length about when she's at Nuremberg, but also when she's on the home front, working in quite challenging circumstances. At Skefco's Bull Racer factory, which is a private wartime commission, she wrote how she was showered with oil and sparks. Her shoes rotted away on the oil-laden floor, noting, "I learnt from the foreman on my first morning that betting in the shop was that I wouldn't last out even for one day. Perhaps that was what made me last out 6 weeks." She was certainly a very determined person. Now, I'm sure this image is an image that's very familiar to a lot of you, which is again held at the Imperial War Museum. I think it's an incredible image. I think it's most probably my favourite image of her war works. And what the committee wanted to do by commissioning this work was draw attention to the armaments and munitions industries and to those employed in them, predominantly women. Approximately 1/3 of total output in British factories during the Second World War was made possible by the 5.5 million women working in production. Towards the end of 1942, Laura was asked to paint Ruby Loftus, a Royal Ordnance factory worker, undertaking one of the most difficult operations in the making of armaments, screwing the breech ring for a Bofors gun. Failure to complete this operation with extreme precision, and I think you can see that by her look of concentration in this work, could result in a violent blowback when the gun was fired. In March 1943, Laura agreed to a fee of 100 guineas and expenses, following what was now a customary wrangle between her and the committee regarding her fees and place of work. Later that month, she travelled to Newport Ordnance Factory and stayed in a house belonging to the factory. On her first morning at the factory, she arrived with her canvas, charcoal and paints, and while Loftus continued to work, she set up her easel and a temporary low partition guarded from passing workers. Loftus recalled, "Dame Laura watched me working for a day, making rough sketches of me all the time. Then at the end of the day, she decided which one she liked best, which was one full of go," as she put it. I think that's such a wonderful kind of sign. I think my grandparents would have said, that kind of war attitude. And this is a publication that I'm showing, which you can get. They're freely available to buy on eBay and Abbey Books. I really urge, they are really beautiful and they're really cheap, but they're really beautiful productions, I think. And I've got this one and a few of the others. I think there's like RAF and Army ones as well. And in this, Knight wrote the introduction, and that she vividly recalls her portrayal of Ruby as well. She talks about sorry, I'll go back because if I can go back, because she talks about the Catherine wheel that you can see in this work, about the sparks that are flying off it. The painting, which was the largest single figure the committee acquired during the war, was first shown at the Royal Academy's 1943 annual exhibition and was reproduced in 8 British newspapers the day after the opening day. Loftus' story and portrait were included as ROF Girls' Portrait is Picture of the Year in a British Paramount short film. Actually, that's a really good film to watch on YouTube, because that shows not only Knight, but it shows Ruby Loftus as well at the Royal Academy. And T.W. Earp in the Daily Telegraph wrote of the painting, "This is realism, bold in painting, sharp in contrast, and altogether convincing in its vividness." As you can immediately see, Knight's painting, The Nuremberg Trial, is quite different from the portraits she created for the War Artists Advisory Committee to meet a wartime propaganda need for heroes and role models. With the success of her war pictures behind her, in December 1945, Knight suggested to the committee that she make one important picture of the Nuremberg trials, where prominent Nazi leaders were to answer for their war crimes. The war crimes trial for Nazi war criminals was held in the main courtroom of the Bavarian Central Court of Justice in Nuremberg, where the Nazis had held the party's annual propaganda rallies. The International Tribunal, which tried 21 leading Germans and saw the conviction of 19 major war criminals, including Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Joachim von Ribbentrop. Knight wrote to the committee, "It seems a pity for such an event to go unrecorded, and I feel that artistically it could prove exciting." The committee agreed, and she was to be paid £500 for the work. She was appointed a war correspondent for this work, and in January 1946, she flew to Frankfurt, her first trip in an aeroplane. On arrival, Knight was met by Major Peter Cassens, who drove her to Nuremberg. And I was saying about works that come up at auction. Well, this is a work that only came up a few years ago at Lyell and Turnbull, who are an Edinburgh-based auctioneers. Major Peter Cassen was Deputy Assistant Adjutant General of the British War Crimes Executive, based at the Courthouse, Nuremberg. He was responsible, together with Captain Marsh and Captain Watts Russell, for the care, pass, and travel arrangements of the artist whilst performing her commission on the trials. During Knight's time in Nuremberg, Cassen took her for drives around the ruined city, inspiring the background for her painting. As evidenced by the inscription on this portrait, it reads, "To my dear friend Peter." They became firm friends, and Cassen became extremely important to Knight, particularly after her husband's death and that of her close friend Barry Jackson, who founded the Malvern Festival. She wrote to Cassen in 1963, "Ours is a unique friendship, such as would be hard to match in this life." Also, in one of the display cases at the Ben Uri, there's a lovely menu card, because Cassen also arranged a lunch for Knight and their party at Overton's restaurant in St James's, London, in celebration of her 1965 retrospective exhibition. And Cassen also shared with 4 others in the residuary assets of her estate on Laura Knight's death in 1970, and read the lesson at her memorial service. So that friendship struck up at Nuremberg had lifelong consequences for both of them. The images that I'm showing you now were also on view at the Ben Uri Gallery, and they depict Knight in Germany in the press box, and I think they also show the vast quantity of works that the sketches that she was producing for this work. In the right-hand image, you can see her palette and all those sketches, but also I think you get a sense of how cold it was in Germany at this point. Here she is wrapped up in a blanket around her waist. And then on the left-hand side, you can actually see her sketching and out one of the preparatory drawings for the work. Knight spent 3 months observing the trials from a US broadcasting box above the courtroom, which she compared to being in a box at the theatre, something which she was very familiar with in the 1920s. It gave, in her opinion, it gave the proceedings a sense of disturbing artificiality. The final painting of the high-ranking Nazis is the result of many weeks of intensive work. She made studies of the scene and the individuals involved, whilst also becoming acquainted with the British prosecution team, including, and there are some of these works on show at the Ben Nuri, this portrait of Lord Justice Lawrence, which is a pastel, which I think feels quite different. It's very soft, how he captures her. And Lord Justice Lawrence was the primary British judge at the trial, and was praised for his patience, clarity, and balanced moral perspective throughout the proceedings. Following Knight's commandeering of the American press booth, he joked with her that she had distinguished herself by becoming an international situation in Nuremberg. Beyond the courtroom, he and his wife generously hosted lunches and dinners, parties for both colleagues and visitors. And prior to one such lunch, Knight executed this drawing of him, completing it in a morning. Afterwards, at lunch, he recalled, he talked a lot about the court and told me he too had never been able to get over the horror of passing sentence for hanging. In 1945, Norman Burkitt, one of the foremost advocates of his time, and his legal career is absolutely astounding, and where he came from going through Cambridge, he was elected as the alternate judge to Lord Justice Lawrence. Laura recorded her experience in Germany in a diary, which is now in the possession of Nottinghamshire Archives, and there are actually facsimiles on show here at the Ben Nuri Gallery, revealed how she grappled with the multiple portraits and complex composition of the painting. In her diary, she wrote, "I admire Sir Norman Burkitt's attitude so much. His pity for the 20 wretched creatures in the docks, some of whom know only too well that their days in this world are few. During the whole of this evening spent at the Burkitts, Sir Norman did not seem able to get the prisoners out of his mind, whatever we talked about. He told me also that however horrible the crime, he could never get used to putting on the black cap." So as I said, there are sketches coming up at auction and also through private dealers. And this work was actually with Karen Taylor Fine Art, and she specialises a lot actually in women artists. And this is one of the first sketches that I'm showing, which form part of a series of sketches for the finished painting. This closely cropped sketch details the detail nearest to the position that Knight could see, showing her bird's eye view of the proceedings, looking down from an angle upon the defendants and the military guards standing over them. And I think that the lines in this work, how she's getting that composition or detailing the composition with the very strong diagonal line, and then the guards' black boots all lines up, in stark contrast, I think, to the whites of their helmets. And I think they were fondly known, the guards, as snowdrops because of those white helmets, and also the stark contrast of the white belts. In her letters to her husband, Harold, she expressed the intense emotion generated at the trial. "I am trying my hardest for a dynamic and rather terrible build-up of the design, hoping that the placing of the masses, even apart from the detail, will convey in some way the sensation that not only I, but everyone appears to feel. In it there is much pity, pity perhaps that the human creature could sink to such baseness as these creatures have done." So this drawing also shows the back row of prisoners at the trial, with Albert Speer, Constantine von Neurath, and Hans Fritsch at the very end of the row. And Speer's, Hitler's favoured architect, was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The next two drawings that I'm showing are on view at the Ben Nuri Gallery as part of a permanent loan. And again, I don't think my PowerPoint does justice to those of you who are in the room to actually looking at these works. I think you can really see how Knight is working in these works, building up her picture. And I think they're just incredibly powerful because they are so large. And they show not only the white helmeted military guards who's standing facing Knight, really at the center of the picture, but the four defendants in the first row. Furthest from us is Goering, dressed in the distinctive white suit that he wore throughout the proceedings, hunched over, listening attentively through his headphones. Beside him is Rudolf Hess, his head bent downwards, revealing a bald patch, with his pen poised over his notes. Then Ribbentrop, wearing black rimmed spectacles and civilian clothing, sitting upright and facing forward with his folded hands. And finally, nearest to us, sitting upright, wearing an army tunic and also listening through his headphones, is Wilhelm Kittel. And just seen behind them, leaning forward in the row behind with his chin on his hands, is Karl Donitz. And whilst Goering occupies the actual place in which he sat throughout the trial, many of the other defendants have been placed in different positions by Laura Knight. And two of the defendants in the lineup in the final painting have been omitted. And this is the second work that you can see at the Ben Uri. And this is a much more worked up drawing that Knight has created here of 10 of the defendants, which I'm not going to list. They're all on the Ben Uri website and on the and they're also within the exhibition here. But I think it really shows the meticulous working method of Knight, her understanding of the human form, how she's working up that composition. And also, I think you can see how she's trying to see the colours within the work at this stage. So these are just two of the drawings that Knight creates. But there are also a number of drawings within the Imperial War Museum's holdings, which are all digitized and which are online. I think the sketch that I'm showing you to the left is actually just above Sarah when I was walking around. But I think that they show, you know, that immediacy of capturing a scene, something that she'd really learned when she was depicting the ballet. So, you know, very, very fast moving, that she was just working very quickly, that magic of a line, as she recalled it. And also the image on the right where she's working up in greater detail, I think particularly that the body language of the particular defendants and the placement of their legs and their hands and then their feet within that work. So Knight is working up these drawings. She's showing the placements of each figure. And in the drawing on the left, especially that of Goering, and Knight wrote to her husband about him: a misshapen, gross figure, the head of a bull, a mouth which stretches right across his great face. God gave out no frills in the making of him, but he gave him a fascination beyond words. And in these two sketches, we also start to see her experimenting with colour, and she wrote about that in great detail. She wrote, Goring always wears his grey uniform, which is an indescribable grey of great beauty. The daylight strip lighting has a tendency to destroy the yellows in reds and turn them to rose. The grey covering of some of the prisoners' portfolios it also enhances, and more particularly, those portfolios bound in yellow, which become yellow in character of colour. She wrote about working up the oil painting as it's developed. She wrote, I'm inclined to lay in with turps an Indian red thin foundation because of getting the greeny weird look of the strip lighting, without painting anything real green, except the malachite marble doorway, which you can see actually behind the guards on the back right-hand side. I know only too well the danger of a green scheme and how terrible it can be. make it look green when it isn't really green, and one may achieve beauty. And I think that's a problem that artists have grappled with for hundreds of years. Her painting reproduces faithfully the courtroom scene. In the foreground are the accused and the judiciary, seen from that angle of her being up in the American press box, presented in the manner of a courtroom sketch, a genre of drawing used to memorialize the proceedings in a court of law. In the midst of the dullness, the white helmets of the military guards stand out, offering a sense of order against a backdrop of ruin and explosive mayhem. The barrister Philip Sands, in his article for Art UK of May 26, which I urge you to read, writes about Knight's final arrangement of the defendants as puzzling. He writes, "At the end of the front row, one can see the oversized figure of Erman Göring in his white suit, sitting where he actually sat throughout the trial. Yet many of the other defendants have been shifted around by the artist for reasons that cannot be known. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer and later Governor General of occupied Poland, on whose territory were constructed many of the most notorious death camps. He actually sat in the front row, 6 along from Göring, yet Knight has moved him to the end of the second row, far from Göring. His right hand bears the scars of a failed suicide attempt, and the artist has removed the glove he wore each day in the trial." Knight's diary does, however, give us an insight into why, as the painting evolved, she sought a solution beyond a truly realistic representation of the kind that hitherto characterized her work. Knight was deeply disturbed by what she heard during the trial, and the painting shows the desolate landscape of Nuremberg intruding inside the courtroom like a shared nightmare. On her drives with Peter Casson, Knight was shocked at the destruction of Nuremberg that had taken place during Allied bombing raids on the 2nd of January 1945. The city had been attacked by over 1,000 Allied British and American bombers. She was also appalled by the conditions that the city dwellers lived. Death and destruction are ever present. They had come into the picture. Knight sought to go beyond the realist courtroom. "I strain every nerve and neglect no artifice, of which I know to build on fierce and dramatic lines. So the figures themselves can be used for pawns only, which take their place in a losing game, in an endeavor to rise above reality and avoid the mere historical picture." For the first time, Knight abandoned her usual realist approach. So the walls of the courtroom appear to give way to a mirage of the ruined city. The commission seemed to her the most significant of her life, providing her with the opportunity to be not only a witness to, but also a recorder of a landmark historical event of lasting consequence. In a letter to Harold, she describes her crazy idea that encroaching on the tables of the defendants' council is the ruined city of Nuremberg. The resulting competition shows 2 scenes merged into one, and it seems clear that the subject and the experience moved her and challenged her into a departure from her usual style. The mahogany pews of the courtroom fade, a melodramatic landscape unfolds. Emerging from the burning rubble of this scene, naked bodies are heaped one upon the other, spilling back into the court. In a radio broadcast describing her impressions of Nuremberg, Knight evoked the thousands of dead who lay beneath the rubble and the desperate souls who lived in freezing conditions, in black holes or rooms with one side of which is open. It seems surprising that the heap of bodies, the most striking aspect of Knight's composition, were virtually unremarked upon at the time and have been the subject of relatively little discourse since. Are these the victims of Allied bombing, or perhaps more likely the victims of Nazi terror? Knight certainly manifested her sympathy with the plight of the Jews on a number of occasions during the war, adding her signature to a solemn protest in the Times a few days after Kristallnacht, and the following month in a letter in the Manchester Guardian in support of homeless German artists who were accused of no crime but their Jewish blood. In 1941, she was one of 38 British women to sign a letter in the Yorkshire Observer titled "Allied Women Welded by Hatred," which expressed disdain for Hitlerism and the evils of the Nazi regime. In the light of the Nazi pursuit of racial purity, Knight's paintings of gypsies and black sitters in Baltimore take on a particular significance. In her diary, Knight recorded how deeply she was affected by what she saw. I can never forget the agony that would seize me, an onlooker, alone in that box. Knight flew back to London in April 1946 and was immediately involved in preparation for the year's Royal Academy exhibition. Returning for a recuperation to the Malvern landscape, she was in time to see the orchids in blossom. How lush and green with blossom, how haphazard is our agriculture, oddly shaped, hedged in, dotted with church, cottage, pig pen and haystack, all calm and sweet, as if war had never been and sorrow never was. While Knight may have hoped that the Nuremberg Trial was to be her magnum opus, she must have been disappointed by the muted response it received when it was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1946. The journalist T.W. Earp's review is typical. He says, the self-sufficing realism of the courtroom suddenly switches to lurid allegory in a background of war atrocities, and the work crumbles away, both as composition and statement. But her depiction resonated with those who had experienced the trials firsthand, including Sylvia Maxwell Fyfe, who wrote to her husband, the lawyer, David Maxwell Fyfe, who was at the Nuremberg trials. Her portraits of the prisoners are terrific, so frightfully characteristic. Maybe it is more interesting if one has been there and knows the position in which they sit. The symbolic backcloth effects seems right to me. I feel all that destruction so much a part of the court. By her own admission, Knight had been caught between two conflicting schools of thought and how best to approach this type of historical commission. The challenge, as she saw it, was how to make the scene more consonant with the visionary work of her contemporary and fellow commissioned war artist, Stanley Spencer. Clearly having second thoughts about the experimental dimension of her Nuremberg painting, Knight subsequently produced the second version that I showed earlier with the Ben Uri drawings, in which she omitted the backdrop and replaced them just by the simple sobriety of the courtroom benches. In 1946, writing to Harold, Laura related a conversation with the French artist who had also been commissioned to observe the Nuremberg trials. Admiring the power, beauty, and foolishness of Picasso's drawings, they both agreed on the importance of finding something new to keep at the top. And I'm just showing these really wonderful photographs of Knight towards the end of her life, which were actually photographed by Madame Yvonne, who's the subject of an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery at the moment. And they were, here she is in her studio, where you can see her vast amount of works on the racking behind her. A couple of years before these were taken, Knight was honoured with a large retrospective exhibition in the Diploma Galleries, the sixth living artist to be so honoured and the first woman Royal Academician. Works from throughout her career, some of which I've shown this evening, and from a wide range of private and public collections were shown. Knight's unceasing work ethic was illustrated in a letter to Ella and Charles Napper, who both appeared in that work that I showed, Spring. She wrote about the hang. I've just come back from the Royal Academy, where I've been spending a day cataloguing and such like. The beautifully refurbished diploma galleries, 4 of them, are filled with more than 250 works. I want to tell you particularly is that the old Spring picture of you has been yanked out of the Tate. Age has not wrinkled either the paint or your cells. A reviewer of the exhibition in the Times wrote that while sheltered from modernism, few women artists have delved so widely in the curiosities of life around them and painted what they saw with such observant and transparent delight. In 1970, she was honoured with a large retrospective exhibition at Nottingham Castle Art Gallery and Museum. 3 days before the exhibition, Knight died, aged 92, at Langfield Place, London. As a keen chronicler of 20th century life, Nora Knight's work allows us to enjoy and view works of living that have largely disappeared from view. Her work may not be considered modern in the sense that she didn't engage with the prevailing isms of her time, but she captured the modern world and its inhabitants for us to view and understand more thoroughly today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was absolutely wonderful. So much detail. I'm sure our audience here will have some questions for you, and perhaps our audience online as well. Would anyone here like to kick us off with a question?
I'm going to sit down. I've been standing. I feel like I've been standing up a long time. It's like been an hour. I feel. Yes. Sorry, that has gone on.
I was fascinated when you told us that it was illegal to paint out of doors during the First World War. Can that really be true?
You had to have a permit to sketch outside doors.
From who?
I presume from the government or from the local department. Yeah, I think I said that you had to have a permit to sketch. Yeah.
Also in the Second World War as well. And downstairs we have a little work by Katrina Wilczynski, another woman artist who was a Polish emigre, and she wasn't a commissioned artist at all. But what's very extraordinary about that one is that she did it in 1940. And the lady here, I think, who knows Ramsgate Harbour, we think it's Ramsgate Harbour, we're not quite sure. And you can see just a couple of soldiers right in the foreground as well. And she did that in 1940, just shortly after she'd come to this country as a refugee. So she must have done that slightly surreptitiously because it wouldn't have been encouraged, and certainly other refugee and emigre artists working during the Second World War. I think there are only two that were given permits that I know about, so you did have to get a permit. As Alice said, particularly on the coast, and also just to do things like war damage and things like that. So you might be commissioned to do it. If you weren't commissioned to do it, then you'd have to get some permission. But anyway, back to you. And are there any more questions about your night in particular? Anyone want to ask? Rebecca, do we have questions?
Yes, we do. So Chris asks, did Dame Laura Knight do any sketches of the interpreters for their booths?
I think she did, and I think some of those are at the Imperial Museum. So it would definitely be worth looking on their website. Yes.
Another person, Richard asks, what happened to Harold Knight in World War II?
Gosh, I'm judging that now. Well, Harold Knight was definitely, he was a conscientious objector in the First World War, and I know they definitely had great difficulties when they were down in Cornwall. I'm guessing by the time that they were in the Second World War, he was over fighting age. So that wouldn't have been an issue for them, but certainly in the First World War, that was. And there were other artists, obviously, in the newspaper group being the most famous, who were conscientious objectors. But yes, he did have to work on the land, and he did have certain roles that he had to undertake.
And Alice, just after that, we're right up in thinking, you know, what a great support he was to her, and how unusually he kind of stepped aside because she became a far greater known artist of a married pair. And of course, there are many examples of it being the other way around. So he was sort of magnanimous and supported him that way.
I think so. I mean, I think certainly he was a great commissioned artist. He became Royal Academy before she did. I mean, he went out to Baltimore and she followed him to do those commissions as well. I think there were conflicting stories about him and how supportive he was of her, that he certainly did play that kind of second fiddle. And you're right, you know, most women artists are called wife of, aren't they? I mean, I think even now it happens. There was a recent review in a paper, and it actually, I think it was about Picasso's lover, and it was, you know, lover of Picasso. Now, you know, I don't need to say that she was wife of Harold Knight, do I? We don't need to say it. And actually, when I go into an exhibition now and I see that, I feel quite angry about that actually now. And I think that's something that curators are certainly cutting out, that you don't have to relate to someone's gender or their marital status. And I think that's a really important thing now, that, you know, we champion that.
Okay.
Chris also wonders if you know what was the name of the French artist who also painted at Nuremberg?
Gosh, I think I did, but I don't know if I've got it on that or not. I'm sure a quick Google would find out. I think it's definitely, I know that Sarah's written up about the other nationalities that were there as well. So Knight certainly wasn't alone in being a commissioned artist of the Nuremberg trials, and as a war correspondent as well. I mean, there was also amazing photographer, obviously, Lee Miller. You know, she was there's that amazing photographs being made into a film. She's another artist in that Eiderdown series of books. Amazing photographs of her, you know, in her military uniform with war correspondent on, and they're incredibly powerful works.
We do have a couple of works by there's a Topolsky and also a Joseph Otto Flatten, and they were two of the artists who were sent to do the Nuremberg trials, although the Topolsky is something called a chronicle that he made later, incorporating work he'd made earlier. So the originals of those works are again in the Imperial War Museum. Then he made this chronicle in 1966 when he was worried about Nazi revival. And then the flatter we have downstairs is not actually a Nuremberg work, but a portrait he made of a friend who was from Nigeria who had also settled in North London. And it was a friendship between these two immigrant generations. But certainly they were two of the artists that attended the trial. And as Alice said, Laura was the only woman artist, although of course there were photographers and stenographers. Well, if there's nothing else for us, I think we should let you have a rest.
Thank you.
Fantastic, long detailed talk.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much again.
Not at all, my pleasure.
Everyone, going to restore the lights.